Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Europe hopes to convince Iran to remain in the nuclear deal by setting up a financial mechanism to allow for trade. The special purpose vehicle has, though, been toned down, only allowing Europe to sell items not sanctioned by the United States. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence chiefs have said Iran is abiding by the deal and the alleged threat has been averted. The U.S. president disagrees, mocking his own intelligence community's assertion. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Daniel Rod, who is an economics reporter with BNE IntelliNews, and he is joining us now from Manchester in the UK. And we're also joined by Mr. Sarbas Nazari, who is a journalist and commentator, and he's joining us live now from Aarhus in Denmark. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Sarbas, I'll start with you, if I may. What are your thoughts on the SPV, the Special Purpose Vehicle? How do you think this will all go forward? Do you think Iran will be convinced that this is enough on the part of Europe?
The launch of this SPV mechanism is something that Iran has for long been waiting for and hoping to use as a tool to bypass U.S. sanctions, which came after Trump's departure from the JCPOA. But as you know, as the Europeans know, as the Iranians know very clearly, the fact of the matter is that this is not something enough to handle the whole issue, and Iranians have been quite cautious about this. They clearly understand that this is very little, and in a ways I could say it is a little late, because the impact of the sanctions has already done its damage on the Iranian people's livelihood. What happens in the future is that we all know that this is about small and medium-sized businesses. So it is something that Iranians are just using as a tool so that they could maintain the deal. It's a dying deal. Everyone knows this. It's a dying deal, but Iranians are trying to use this to keep it alive until for like a couple of years, so that politically speaking, things change on the ground in the United States. They're just hoping that the Trump administration is gone in the next couple of years, and it's replaced by probably a Democratic government, which is able to revive the deal and then bring it back on track. That's the thing that we know. And so I don't think that the Iranians are pinning all their hopes on this, but this is just a positive step forward.
Okay, Daniel, what do you make of that? Just one step forward, as Sarbas put it. That's pretty much what I got from Abbas Araghchi's statements about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, from the European point of view, this organization, or Instex as it's called, is operated and owned by the governments of the UK, France, and Germany. Yeah. Ultimately, the business will act as an intermediary for the most basic essentials, which is medical items, medicines, and food. Ultimately, this is not what Iran wants. Iran wanted a opening of trade and everything. It is a stopgap measure for development, but in the long run, something else has to come from this. And as much as Tehran has protested against the idea of a humanitarian SPV, this is all they're going to get for the moment.
And do you think that'll be enough, Daniel, or do you think that the Iranians, the political pressure within Iran will be just too much for Iran to remain within this deal just with this small gesture?
Like you say, it's a small gesture. In the long run, something else has to come from this. Iran was intending for this to be an oil trading platform, oil for goods barter house. This hasn't happened, and the Europeans have come back with this thing, which is a humanitarian SPV, which aims not to annoy the Americans. In the long run, they are meeting the guidelines of the Americans as much as they're protesting that they are now defying the Americans. So it's a poor response for a serious situation.
Okay, and Sarbaz, what do you make of that? Do you think that internal Iranian pressure, or pressure within itself, as I should put it, on the government there will just be too much to remain within this deal even after this gesture?
Well, what we know for a fact is that the hardliners in Iran have been piling up pressure on the government of President Rouhani ever since the JCPOA was signed. And this pressure has intensified, particularly after the Trump departure from the deal. But we also know that the supreme leader, although not very publicly, but he is supportive of the policies of President Rouhani when it comes to the JCPOA, although he has warned that you cannot trust the Europeans that much. But the fact of the matter is that he does support this SPV. This is an undeniable fact. So the pressure from the hardliners, from the conservative media, will pile up, but I don't think it will work that much. And President Rouhani's government, this SPV is an opportunity for President Rouhani to take the best benefit out of it, because it shouldn't be lost. It's the only chance for this dying JCPOA to remain alive for the next couple of years. So despite the pressure from the hardliners, it will not be that effective to change the course. And Iran will stay within the JCPOA, although this pressure is always there.
Okay, so, Daniel, this is all at a time that Europeans, even the ones that are part of the SPV and, as you said, Instex, they have placed sanctions on Iran for issues, of course, beyond the nuclear deal itself. That also muddies the waters, doesn't it?
It's a complicated situation where the Europeans are torn on the one side from the political situations of the Iran and its extraterritorial actions in Europe, or alleged in Denmark and France and Belgium. They understand the situation, but they also understand the much more depressing and worrying situation that if Iran doesn't have this SPV operational, the situation could be much worse for the region. The worst thing Europe could want is an influx of Iranians who are financially broke, and they're looking for a better way of life. So the idea is of the SPV is to keep the Iranian economy ticking along in the most basic form, and hopefully, as your previous guest just said, meet the next US administration, which hopefully would be more open to the JCPOA in the long run.
Okay, so Sarbas, tell us about, because you are in Denmark, so you're on the spot just for a moment, Sarbas. What is the feeling in Denmark right now towards Iran, especially with those allegations, as Daniel there brought up? Because I imagine all of that is playing a role in how Europe is acting towards Iran at this time.
The approach taken by the Danish government, it's something that I would say comes from the U.S. pressure. And Iranians have repeatedly denied those allegations. And we also know that the Danish government has not much publicly presented any proof about those allegations. And things are still cloudy for all sides on this. And, the approach that Copenhagen is following is quite in line with that of the U.S. administration, but that cannot be generalized to the whole European Union. And as we saw with the launch of this SPV, it does mean that the Europeans are very much hopeful about this JCPOA, because they understand this as a very important fruit of years-long diplomacy, and they don't want to miss this opportunity, because an Iranian pullout from the deal brings a lot of instability to the region, to a region which is already engulfed with different types of crises. So they want to keep Iran at the negotiating table, because it's just one step, and the next steps that they are imagining and they are hoping for is is negotiating with Iran over different issues like the missile program, like the regional influence, Iran's key role in Syria and Iraq. Although Iran has repeatedly stated that its missile program is a red line, but it is possible that at some point of time, if things just positively go forward, that Iran might also discuss all those issues with the Europeans. So Europeans are taking this step because it's not just about the nuclear program per se, and they're hoping that in the future all other thorny issues will be discussed and will come to a negotiated solution.
Okay, so Daniel, let's talk economics just for, if we may, because as you well know, Daniel, a lot of European companies have already walked away from Iran, some very major ones. So we can name those deals for airplanes, for example, essentially being cancelled at this point in time. What do you make of what companies in Europe will be thinking at this point in time vis-a-vis Iran? Because obviously the United States has been very clear, listen, you need to choose between our market and the Iranian market, and that seems like quite a black and white choice. Obviously, from a business standpoint, the American market is that much larger. Is anyone really going to, European, I'm saying, going to remain working with Iran at this point, do you think?
You've got to understand that in the year 2017-18, EU-Iran trade amounted to 600 million euros. Okay, so it's not a small amount. And we're not talking just about automotive cars, automotive companies like Peugeot or Citroën. We're talking about a range of different goods and items, including the medicine. So it's integral for Iran to keep trading with the European companies. And the mechanisms in place now, including the Swiss special business channel, which allows Swiss-only companies to continue to trade with Iran through a banking mechanism, has been green-lighted by the US. The European SPV, registered in the French Ministry of Economy, if I have read right, is now backed by the three governments at the highest levels. So for companies, they need the assurances of their governments to be able to continue to trade. And just, as we saw this week, companies like Citroën are continuing to do as much trade as they can, albeit as limited with the capabilities they have at the moment. And, it's not Iran of 2015, it's Iran of 2019, and the economy has taken a huge hit. Inflation's now standing at something around 30 to 40% officially. So the long-term projections for sales to Iran have obviously declined. But Europeans want to keep open their business channels.
Okay, so Sarbas, I wonder then, what are your thoughts at this point in time? Again, I'm going to go back to a question I put to you earlier about the pressure on the Rouhani government, because as you well know, Sarbas, it's been about results, hasn't it, within Iran. Do you think that Rouhani will be able to weather this storm? In the sense, will he be able to show his own citizens, really, that this is still all worth it to remain in the deal for, when so many European companies have walked away, when we've had those very vital plane deals being cancelled?
The majority of Iranian voters who are pinning all their hopes onto this deal are already extremely disappointed. If you talk to ordinary Iranians on the streets in Tehran, and especially in smaller cities, they express this very clearly, and they have lost all hope, because President Rouhani has been given a lot of promises about the outcomes of the JCPOA, but on the ground, what they have seen is nothing but skyrocketing prices, untamed inflation, and a declining purchasing power, and they will not buy anything more from President Rouhani, because these promises have been repeated for years now. And so even with this new step taken by the Europeans, tangible outcomes I don't think will be felt any time soon for ordinary Iranians. So
Okay.
I don't believe that this will re-inject any sort of hope among the Iranian public.
Okay, guys, we're just going to go into a very short break. Please do stay with us. Viewers, stay with us as well. We're going to continue this conversation about, of course, the JCPOA, that Iran nuclear deal. After the break, we're going to discuss a bit more about U.S. intelligence chiefs and their assessment of where the Iran nuclear deal stands at this point in time and the results of it. I'll be back with that just after this short break. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us, viewers. We're still discussing the Iran nuclear deal and the latest news regarding that, of course, the SPV, which Europe has brought forth under the Instex initiative. Now I want to discuss with our guests who are still joining us, Daniel and Sarbas, about the U.S. intelligence chiefs. Daniel, U.S. intelligence chiefs telling the Senate Intelligence Committee that Iran was not developing nuclear weapons. That would, of course, be in violation of this deal at this time. Trump, as you well know, tweeting that he disagrees with that point, essentially mocking his own intelligence community. What do you make of, at this point in time, that sort of confusion coming out of the United States?
I mean, it's quite clear that Trump has his own opinions on several subjects, as the world has learned over his 2-year tenure in the White House. Iran is no different from that. When we look at his trajectory of thought over the past couple of years, we can see that he's becoming incredibly more hardline on subjects like Iran to deflect from wider situations inside the country, i.e. the shutdown. So half of his posturing is for internal audiences, I would suggest, especially on his Twitter account. So I don't honestly think Trump believes Iran is a threat, but he's using the country as the so-called bogeyman to scare the U.S. public into submission on certain subjects, and Iran being the main one in that situation.
So this is a dangerous game then, isn't it, Sarbaz? Because if Iran is being used as a boogeyman and Trump is playing fire with this nuclear deal, I imagine that's also bad for U.S. interests, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And, as your guest just correctly mentioned, what Trump has been saying is just for domestic consumption. And this lack of coordination between Trump's personal opinions and his teams in different categories has been something that we have witnessed in the past couple of years. So when it comes to Iran also, we know that Trump might deep down understand that Iran is not a threat, and the nuclear deal is a positive step for regional and global peace. But what he has in his mind is just destroying a legacy that was left from Obama. And because, for example, in the case of North Korea, he went ahead. He sat down with a leader who has been openly threatening the United States. But when it comes to the JCPOA and Iran, although he knows that the Iranian nuclear program is no threat in comparison with North Korea, he considers this as a bad deal because it was just a breakthrough that happened during the Obama administration's term. So he's just trying to destroy that legacy, and it is fundamentally a partisan issue, a political issue. He understands very well the value that the JCPOA could bring to international diplomacy.
So then, Daniel, this is then an alarming situation for the Europeans, isn't it? And I know you alluded to this in your earlier answers, but the Europeans, as you're looking at this sort of rhetoric coming out of Trump specifically, versus, of course, the intelligence community, his own intelligence community, that is, and thinking, if Iran or the Europeans or if the entire deal just falls apart, what will happen the day after? And considering, of course, Europe is that much closer to Iran, Do you think the Europeans will do everything in their power to save this deal, or do you think that they will also at some point come under U.S. pressure and walk away?
I mean, if you're looking at the European Union from a 27 or 28 member perspective, with the UK still in it till March, there are divisions. Poland, on the one hand, is trying to move up to Trump's side while offering to host this anti-Iran summit. However, it's been lukewarm reception from the rest of the European Union. Other countries like the Italians are playing both sides, and the UK has its own issues with regards to Brexit and the wider implications of post-Brexit trade. So each country has its own, issues to deal with. And with the European Union in general, if you're talking from the Federica Mogherini level, they have remained committed to the project, because ultimately, if this falls apart, there's going to be unknown consequences across the board that nobody has factored in yet. And it's better the devil you know in the situation as this.
Sarbas, let me go to you. What do you think, Sarbas, that the North Koreans are thinking at this point in time, looking at the way that the Americans are acting at this point in time, and of course how the Europeans are trying to save this deal?
The North Koreans are, as you just mentioned, are closely monitoring the situation, and they will come to the point that the United States cannot be a reliable partner when it comes to international deals. So they are very cautious about this, because the JCPOA is proving to be a very bad precedent, and this will affect any potential future deal between North Korea and the rest of the international community, and especially the United States. So this creates a very gloomy picture and a very bleak future for any negotiation with Pyongyang. And that's something that they're closely monitoring, and I'm sure that it gives them some sort of warning that the United States, and especially this administration, is not a reliable side to sit down with.
Okay, I'll give the final word to Daniel, who I believe is back with us. Daniel, give us your final thoughts, if you may. What do you think will happen in the days to come vis-a-vis the Instex and the SPV, and of course how the Americans will react? At this point in time, the Americans have said this will not interfere with our quote-unquote maximum pressure campaign at this point in time. Do you think that the Iranians, the people of Iran, that is, will feel any of the benefits of this deal going forward?
From the point of view of the Americans, long-term wise, they've already previously said that they will not interfere with the trade of humanitarian goods, and that is why the Europeans have created it in the SPV in such a manner to begin with. Internally within Iran, there will be no immediate benefits, as there were no immediate benefits to the JCPOA and the removal of sanctions. This stuff takes a long time, and with the removal of sanctions, you had 80% of the sanctions on Iran removed. Now we have invisible sanctions on Iran, you would say. None of the Europeans are technically sanctioning any form of trade with Iran, but all international transactions are banned again. And ultimately, it's now a juggling act for any company that wants to do trade, hence why the SPV is there for the most basic form. But as for the person on the street, it's going to be very difficult for them to even discover any benefit to this second round of sanctions, at least for the time being.
Very well. We'll leave there at that as a word, but of course we appreciate both of you taking your time out of your busy schedules to speak to us here in the Scope today. That was Daniel Rod, economics reporter at BNE and Telenews, speaking to us from Manchester in the UK. We were also joined by Sarbas Nazari, journalist and commentator, who's speaking to us from Aarhus in Denmark. We of course appreciate both of your analyses. Viewers, as both of our guests there spoke about throughout this segment, the Iran nuclear deal has various facets, of course. The biggest, of course, at this point in time, and the most important news that we're following the developments for is Instex and the SPV mechanism that the Europeans have brought forth in order to try to appease Iran enough that it stays within this nuclear deal, to try to convince it that it is getting some sort of a benefit off of this deal, which the Iranians, of course, have demanded from day one, and which has been, of course, written in plain words in this deal itself. The Americans, of course, have walked away, want to continue their maximum pressure campaign, even though they know that this deal actually is benefiting even their own national interests. We'll keep a close eye on that situation here in the Scope. Don't go anywhere, though. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Viewers, thank you for staying with us here in the Scope. In this segment, we're going to discuss Bangladesh garment factory workers who recently protested demanding living wages. In response, more than 5,000 have been fired. 6 years after the Rana Plaza tragedy and after Western brands had promised to ensure workers' rights, why is the labor rights situation in these factories not better? Factory bosses say pressure by global brands is only increasing upon them to keep costs down. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined by our esteemed guests, Mr. Vanpeperstraete, who is a lobby and advocacy coordinator for the Clean Clothes campaign. He's joining us now from Brussels. We're joined by Aruna Kashyap, who is a lawyer. She works as a senior counsel for the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch, and she's worked excessively on the rights of garment workers in countries throughout Asia. We're also joined by Mr. Asad Rehman, who is the executive director of the War on Want, a global anti-poverty charity. Thank you all for joining us and for sparing your time out of your busy schedules to speak to us. Ben, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What were your thoughts about, of course, the protests that took place in Bangladesh and the ensuing, layoffs and firings of all these people?
Well, to a certain extent, it was something that could have been expected because we knew that minimum wage the statutory minimum wage was rising, but vastly insufficient to provide a good means of income for these workers. At the same time, as we've heard also from garment factory owners in Bangladesh, the prices that brands give to factories is not necessarily rising, and there is evidence suggesting that it even goes down. So something needs to give. And so it was only logical that in a climate that becomes much more repressive, that there is a number of workers, a vast group of workers who says, okay, enough is enough. We want to claim better rights. And where we've seen the Bangladeshi government and the factory owners go in the last years, especially keeping into mind also the strikes in the end of 2016 on wages, it was also, unfortunately, not a surprise that the Bangladeshi government would have a repressive and aggressive response to this. So it's unfortunate, but it was unfortunately also to be expected where things were going.
And, Aruna, it defies logic, doesn't it, that we're still talking about this after that Rana Plaza tragedy when so much of the world gave so much attention to this issue. Why is this still not resolved? Why aren't these people's rights being respected properly?
I'm going to share some few quick statistics that emerged from a recent survey. It's called the Garment Worker Diaries. It was a project that looked at workers' wages through in-depth surveys over a period of a year. And here's what they found. They found that workers worked in the factories for over 60 hours. That's excessive overtime. That's legally permitted. The only time this didn't happen was around Eid. In about 65% of the pay periods, workers received salaries below the minimum wage. 50% of the time, factories failed to pay overtime wages, which is what the law requires factories to do. And as a result, workers were earning between 28 and 35 takas an hour. That's less than 50 cents. It's anywhere between 30 to 40 cents US dollars.
Right.
And the only asset most of the workers owned was a cell phone. So we're talking about workers who are really living in abject poverty. And going back to the point that this should be happening, which is the pertinent question, that this should be happening even after so many years of Rana Plaza and lobbying. There are two, the Bangladesh government is primarily responsible for how, for this condition, for their poor lax labor monitoring. And the factory owners are also primarily responsible, but there are drivers of this problem, which comes back to the point Ben alluded to, which is if you have a certain set of brands who are outsourcing production to countries where labor costs are poor, which is the driving force behind why they want to produce in these countries, they are part of the problem. And that problem needs to be fixed. That if you're in theory, if a brand says that I am committed to paying workers a statutory legal minimum wage, at the very least, they have to factor in the costs, the direct and indirect costs that factories will incur to pay minimum wages and overtime wages. And we cannot have it any other way. So, yes, factories are responsible. They shouldn't be violating these laws, but where are the brands?
Indeed, and that's a good point, and that's a point I wanted to bring up with you. What about these brands and the fact that, again, over these years there has been some spotlight, hasn't there, about these brands and the fact that they are essentially sweatshops, overseas, which are making their clothes for them, which they sell at, some of them at least, at a very high cost to their customers somewhere in the Western world. What do you think about how the brands have been acting throughout this time?
Well, absolutely. I think you're right. It is a question of, and when we say brands, I think we should be saying, about big corporate business, because actually this is a global problem. Look, last week, a statistic came out which showed again that half the world's population, that's 3.5 billion people, are living on less than $5.50 a day. That's far less than they need to live a living wage or a dignified life, not enough to be able to eat and, have the basic amenities like access to education or health, etc. And that's not because there's not enough wealth. In fact, wealth is increasing around the world. It's just inequality is increasing. And that's because we have an economic model, the neoliberal economic model, which has put corporations and their profit as the primary driver. And governments just don't have the ability to be able to, govern the actions of these corporations, right? And that's why there's many of us who've been campaigning for many years saying that there actually needs to be new legal treaties, binding treaties on the power of multinationals, making them responsible for the whole of their supply chain, making them responsible for the economic, environmental and social costs of their production. Because we live in a world where increasingly, the West outsources its production and there's a race to the bottom. So in Bangladesh, when you speak to people in the government, etc., in the factory workers, and Bangladesh, relies 80% of its foreign earnings come from the garment industry. There's a race to the bottom. They will say we have to squeeze the margins because if we don't, this industry will move somewhere else. It may move to Cambodia, it may move to Ethiopia, etc. And that's what's happened. The neoliberal model has simply allowed corporations to move country to country and exploiting vulnerable workers. The answer to that is, I think, of course, twofold. One, in Bangladesh, of course, it requires, yes, statutory minimum wage, living wage. It requires powerful trade unions to be able to hold their own factories and the government accountable, and a powerful civil society that will advocate that. But of course, also in the Europe and in the West where these products are sold, and it is absolutely outrageous. We have an example a couple of weeks ago where a charity T-shirt made for a charity that was going to raise money about concerns about gender exploitation, was paying workers in Bangladesh 35 pence and was selling here for between 15 and 20 pounds. I mean, the profit margin that these corporations are amassing is absolutely huge. But what that requires is us to put pressure, not as individuals, but to put pressure on the government to actually regulate these companies and make them responsible for their supply chains.
Okay, and I'm glad you brought up that example, Asad. I wanted to put that question to you, Ben, because, that example that Asad just brought up, the Spice Girls and comic relief scandal, about that charity T-shirt being made in a factory where staff were not only paid very low, but were abused and did grueling work for very, very low pay. It's an example, isn't it? And it's very symbolic, isn't it, Ben, of this entire issue that we're talking about how many in garment factories, and I don't want to just concentrate on Bangladesh, but that's a very good example, of course, are being paid less than even local living wages in many cases. Do you think that there is a disconnect, Ben, in the minds of consumers and of course, the costs that they don't know go into making these clothes, costs not in dollar terms, but in the fact that a lot of these people are not paid well?
Well, I don't think that there is necessarily disconnect between what consumers want and what is happening, because indeed, you're right that what happened with the Spice Girls T-shirts is just one event which happens in so many other factories in identically the same fashion, but there's not necessarily a spotlight on that. So you're sitting with an endemic problem of low wages, of abuse, of poor labor rights. And at the same time, there's a lot of people who are looking for how can we fix this. We think it's not necessarily appropriate to look at the consumers, because also consumers, they, on the one hand, buy whatever is offered to them in stores. But secondly, a lot of consumers actually would like to buy ethically produced garments, or garments that are produced in humane circumstances. So the problem is not necessarily there. The problem is, as Asad mentioned, the power structure of the corporation in between. It's what are the H&Ms and the CNAs doing in order to identify these abuses, and what are they doing to stopping them and to prevent them. And they have all the levers there. They have the direct relationships with the factories. They can demand that labor rights are respected. They can increase prices whenever there's an increase needed in wages. So there's a lot of power with the brands. The brands then often say, well, we're just doing what consumers want us to do, but that's not entirely true either, because brands do spend a lot of resources as well on advertisement. And they wouldn't spend those resources if they would believe that they could not shape the desires and the minds of consumers. Otherwise, they wouldn't spend roughly a quarter of let's say, the price of a T-shirt on that publicity and marketing. At the same time, if you then look at that price of a T-shirt, the cost that goes to wages and to the actual worker that produces it is between 0.5% or 1% or 2%. So even within the price of, let's say, a €5 T-shirt that gets sold in Europe or elsewhere, there's a lot of room for redistribution and to take maybe some of that marketing budget away and to dedicate that to better, safe and decent working conditions for those making the T-shirts and the products.
Right. Aruna, I wonder what you make of the that Asad and Ben have put forth, because I feel like, as Ben there put, that the brands can say, listen, the consumers are demanding, costs to remain down at the very least, and or consumers, because let's be honest, Aruna, that for a lot of us, and I'll talk about myself personally, when I walk into a store to buy clothing, I don't necessarily at that point in time immediately think of all that's gone into producing those pair of jeans or those socks or those shirts. Do you think that there is enough awareness? Do you think that consumers genuinely care a lot about this, about ethically produced garments, etc.?
I certainly think the awareness is growing, but I think there's a need certainly to improve that awareness. For example, How many of us know that if we look at something and say, okay, I want this ordered and delivered to me within the next 3 days, what goes behind it? What are the processes? What is the type of, if I want this style and I've looked at the style, this is what I want. Or if I want, this particular season and this is the look I really like, what does that mean? How many seasons do I want? I mean, those are things that consumers should be having better awareness of, because then there's a realization of what a workers put through or what factories are put through when they want to have 18 different styles a year, for example. What does it mean? And there is a certain need for greater consumer awareness, but that is growing. What is happening today, and it's true that there are very, very big corporations who have a lot of control and power over the supply chain and are very well positioned to take good leadership decisions at the top level to change how this operates. They can change it. The problem is change is not happening soon enough, and it's simply because of the priorities of the decisions of the company, which is they are prioritizing profiteering over workers' rights and workers' lives, which is unacceptable. And that has to change. And that's where I think not only consumers, but big investors should also understand that this is a problem where if as a shareholder or an investor, my only interest in a company is looking at the growth of the company and the profit the company is making, then I'm also part of the problem, because I have to be interested in what the company is doing to pay better prices, improve how it's treating its factories as a business partner, and what it's bringing for factories.
Right.
And over here, I need to make the point also that over the last couple of years, there has been a shift away. If you look at the where are the markets growing? That yes, US and the EU markets are very, very big consumers, and that's where a lot of the products are going. But there is also being a growing shift away to other Asian markets, including domestic markets, and that those brands also have a lot of power. And they're also producing in country, and that has to change. They also have to be aware of their responsibilities, because these problems apply across the board to everybody who's producing.
Right. So, Asad, I'll give you the final word, if I may. We've discussed a lot about the problems that currently exist, Asad. But I imagine, the Bangladesh government, for example, could argue to listen, fine, if we give our workers what they're demanding vis-a-vis a living wage, what's to say these brands will not tomorrow move on to another country or another place in the world which offers them, again, the same exact deal which we are currently offering them. This is sort of a vicious cycle, isn't it? So put into realistic terms, then, Asad, what can actually be done to try and resolve this issue globally?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, and that's what lots of the corporations always threaten governments and their workforce with. And it's not just simply about the garment industry. We see this right across many other sectors as well. And as I said, it's an exploitative economic model. And the only way to deal with that is regulation. We have a model of consumption, which is, of course, consuming without any regard or understanding of the production of it, of its environmental impact, social, economic, and human impact. And that needs to be brought to the fore. So, of course, part of it is about educating people and consumers about what the impact. But really, the answer isn't whether I or you decide this is more ethically made than this. The real answer is regulation. And so that regulation has to come at both a national level and at a global level. It's no good for the Bangladesh government to simply say, well, these corporations have power, so we are going to create an unregulated market for them, because the influence of these corporations is doing exactly that. And the answer hasn't been that it has increased the economic well-being of the citizens of that country. So the question we must always ask ourselves, are our political leaders acting in our interests or in the interests of these corporations? Yes, there needs to be action at a global level. There needs to be action about specific supply chains and forcing these big brands, whether they're H&M's or the CA, to take responsibility for the whole of the supply chain. And when they say, and many of them, if you look at their brand profiles. They will say, well, we're socially conscious, we're ethically conscious, we pay a living wage, etc. But what they don't take responsibility for is each stage of their supply chain, and that is possible. That requires action with trade unions in the global north and action with the trade unions in the global south as well. By working together, we can force these brands to change. So the simple answer is it's regulation. That's the only answer to this problem.
Okay, we'll leave it there at that. I know we've just touched the tip of the iceberg with this issue, but of course we appreciate all of you, A, to take your time out to speak to us here in the scope, and secondly, of course, for the insights you've brought to this discussion. Let me start from the top and thank our guests. We were joined by Mr. Ben Vanpeperstraete, who is the Lobby and Advocacy Coordinator for the Clean Clothes Campaign. We were also joined by Ms. Aruna Kashyap, who is a lawyer, Senior Counsel for Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch, and she's worked on the rights of garment workers in many countries throughout Asia. We were also joined by Mr. Asad Rehman, who is the Executive Director of the War on Want, a global anti-poverty charity. Now, viewers, as all of our guests there spoke about, and towards the end, I think Asad mentioned something very interesting and very important, I think, which I think is important to highlight, and that is the will needs to exist at this point in time, the political will specifically, and of course, on the part of consumers as well, I would argue that that will needs to exist to come up with regulation, global regulation that is, and not just for Bangladesh or for any other such example that we may find where workers are being abused, paid low wages, lower sometimes than even living local wages are around them within their own city, within their own district. A very, very vast issue, but one that's very important to highlight for its politics, for the way corporations act globally. We'll keep a close eye on all such issues here in the scope as well. Thanks for watching, though, this edition. I've been Waqar Rizvi.